Welcome back, knitting friends. All right, congratulations. We have knit a washcloth. So, you guys made it to this point. Hopefully you still have 20 stitches on the top of your row. If you don't, it's okay. We're going to cover that today. In our lesson, we're going to talk about dropped stitches. What happens if you accidentally lost a stitch somewhere along the way, and or if you gained a stitch and maybe now you have 21, 22 stitches on here at the top. So I do want to remind you guys, if your washcloth doesn't look absolutely perfect today, that's okay. We're learning. We're going to get there. I'm really proud of you guys for having made it this far. So let's start with dropped stitches. I'm going to go ahead and knit along this row here, and I'm going to drop a stitch. So we're knitting along. I'm going to get to the middle of my row here. Alright, now let's say I just accidentally pull that stitch off. Now, if I catch it at this stage, see how, I'm going to bring it a little close and focus the camera here. Okay. Now see how there's a little bump there? I've dropped my stitch. And there's a little bump on the top there. Now, if I catch it early enough, I can just slide my needle back in there and save it and pick it up. That's if you catch it early. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes that slides off. Oops, I didn't even notice, and I kept knitting into my next stitch. When I get to the end of my row, I'm going to knit all the way to the end of my row here. And that's when I realize, there's something goofy happening right there. And if I put a little bit of tension on this, I realize that that stitch is going to start to slip down my work, and this whole row could possibly slide out all the way down, and you'll start to see this gapping in your stitches here. So, what I'm going to do to fix that, if I see that there's my stitch, it's starting to slip out, and here's where it came undone, here's my missing stitch here. And hopefully, you know, as you guys practice, you'll start to be able to spot these things, and you'll be able to visually identify them as they happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse back to this stitch here. So starting at the end of my row, I'm basically going to undo those last few stitches. So I'm kind of reverse stitching. I'm sliding my needle into that lower stitch. So right here, I'm going to slide my needle in there. And I'm going to pull that last stitch there. So I'll show you again. Here's my stitch, my lower stitch. I'm going to slide my needle in. I'm going to pull that stitch out. We're going to keep unraveling this row, and I'm just pulling that yarn tail as I go to unravel it. Go. Just gonna back it up until we get to our dropped stitch here. So here we are back at our dropped stitch. So next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna, just like I did before, I'm gonna find that little bump where my last stitch is that's available, I'm going to find that and pull it through. You're going to put it back on your dominant hand needle. And then, see this lead here? This loose tail? Right there. I'm going to pick that up onto my dominant hand needle. Did you see what I did there? So I go under and pick it up, and I'm going to pull this stitch over. So that brought that loop back up onto the stitch. And then I'm going to move it back over here. So we just picked up that stitch and we fixed that drop there. So we're able to resume knitting again. And my stitch is back in line there. You're not always going to catch these, but when you do, try and pull that stitch back up. So, we just learned how to pick up a dropped stitch. That's great. Now what happens if I accidentally, let's say I accidentally stitch into the same stitch twice, and now there's an extra stitch there. So I'll show you again. I'm knitting along, and maybe I knit into the same stitch twice, or I pulled it off, and now I just put 2 stitches into 1 stitch. One more time. So I'm knitting, and now I have 2 stitches in 1. Well, we're going to do basically the same thing. We're going to back that stitch up. So you see this lower loop here where there's 2 stitches coming out of? Slide that needle back in there and just back it up. So as we're knitting along, we want to make sure that it's a 1-to-1 ratio to keep our work the same size. 1 stitch in 1 loop. And that's how we keep everything nice and square and even. Alright. So if you had any of those issues while knitting your washcloth, feel free to, if you want to and you have time to, unravel to the point where you had the issue and start knitting up again and try and keep everything just 20 stitches and even. If you're like, it's got a flaw, but I'm okay with it, we can go ahead and move forward. Because trust me, you're going to have, there are going to be flaws. You're going to learn as you go. It's okay. So the next thing I'm going to show you guys is how to actually get your washcloth off of the needles. So this is called casting off. And with both casting on and casting off, there are multiple ways to do it. It will give you different visual techniques. The cast on that I showed you to start this was very basic cast on where we wrapped the yarn around our thumbs. This cast off that I'm going to show you is a very basic cast off. Once we develop these techniques, you can start using very particular cast on and cast off for different projects. Maybe you have a hat where you want like a stretchy ribbed edge. So you want a more elastic cast off for that, or maybe you're knitting maybe a blanket and you want a really decorative edging on it. So you can use a decorative cast off or cast on for that. So let's go ahead and cast off. So we're going to start just like we're knitting. So just like we normally knit, slide your needle in, wrap the yarn around, pull off your stitch. And then we're going to go on to our second stitch, slide the needle in, wrap the yarn around, pull the stitch off, and then in order to cast off, all we do is pull this first stitch over the second stitch. And then we continue knitting onto the next stitch, slide the needle in, pull the yarn out through, and we do it again. So you're going to pull that first stitch over the second stitch. Try that again. Put the needle through, pull the yarn through, pull the first stitch over the second stitch. And here you can see we're getting our cast off edge there. Now, just like with the knitting, you want to be aware of tension. You might be pulling this really tight. You might be doing a really loose cast off. And as you get more comfortable, you'll get more consistent with the tension here. So I'm just going to do this with you guys, and we're going to cast off our washcloth here. Okay, awesome. So we made it to our final stitch. We have our last stitch from our cast off edge here on the end of our needle. So to finish this off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a big loop here. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to slide my needle out of there. And then I'm going to give myself kind of a healthy amount of yarn here. So I'm going to give myself a lead, maybe 12 inches, 12, 13 inches. You could use your needle for reference there. And then I'm going to cut my end. So I just cut that loose from my ball of yarn. Tuck this back up. And now I have my loose end of yarn and I have my final loop here. And what I'm going to show you guys is how to make our loop end that we're going to hang our washcloth from. So I'm going to slide my fingers into that loop, make a little pinchers, slide my fingers into the loop, and I'm going to grab that tail end and pull it through. Just like with our slip knot earlier, we're going to repeat that process. I'm going to put my pinchers through the hole, grab the end, pull it through. Slide my pinchers through, grab the yarn, pull it through. Slide my pinchers through, and we're creating this sort of slip chain there. And you don't need to pull it super tight. You just want to slide that knot down. And we're going to continue doing this until we feel like our loop is long enough. If you want a bigger loop, you can cut your string a little bit longer. I keep doing this until I kind of come up on the end of my tail here. So we'll do maybe one more. Let me show you guys. So this is going to be my last one here, where I pull my yarn through, and I'm just gonna go ahead and keep pulling. So let me focus the camera, and I'm gonna give you guys a zoom here. All right, there we go. So now we have this chain here, and we've got our loose end, and all I have to do is I'm gonna feed this loose end through my embroidery needle. So you guys should all have an embroidery needle in your pack. And in order, I'll show you the easiest way I know to thread this embroidery needle. So what I do is I hold my yarn in a little folded over loop there. I slide my needle in there and use it to kind of pinch the end, which kind of aligns all the fibers and gets them taut. And then I roll my needle end over that little bump there. And you see how that feeds it through? And then I pull it all the way through. Okay, now I'll show you another way to do this. If that didn't work out for you and you want to feed from the end of your yarn into your needle, I kind of flatten it along my finger and try to roll the fibers through the tapestry needle. Now I tend to struggle with this one a little bit more because the fibers want to separate at the end of the yarn there. But that is an option if that's easier for you. Remember, knitting is a process of a lot of personal preferences, so there's no absolute right or absolute wrong way to do things. You just need to figure out what's best for you. Okay, so now I've got the end. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. There we go. So I've got the end of my chain tail there, and we're about to form our loop. So all I'm going to do is slide this needle into my work, and you just kind of want it on the edge here. Don't slide it in too far into the work. You want to be getting these edge bumps right on the corner here. And then I'm just going to kind of pass it through a couple of times, and you can sort of weave that. You can weave that needle. We're going to kind of go up and down in the work. Now, since this is a washcloth, this item is going to get quite a lot of use. So we want to really make sure that that end is woven into our work. So feel free to just kind of pass it along that corner of the work back and forth and weave it in. And we can even go back up through our chain here. Make sure that connection is solid. And now, generally speaking, in knitting, you want to always avoid putting knots into your work. It kind of interrupts the texture and the stretch of a knit. But if you, particularly because this is a washcloth, if you're really worried about that end becoming unraveled or coming apart, feel free to put a little knot at the end of your work there. Pull that tight. So double knot that there. All right, so that was this is a little bit of a smaller loop than the first one I made, so if you want to give yourself a longer tail so you can have a longer loop on there, and I just cut off the remaining edge There we are. So now we have the loop on our washcloth. The next step is going to be to weave in our starting tail. So this was the tail from when we first started our work. So let me show you one more time. How I thread my needle here. So I pull it up through, give myself some tension to align those fibers. Roll that onto my needle, just like that, and pull it through. There we go. Okay, now similar to our loop end, I'm going to weave this end into my work. And if any of you are sewers, think of this like a back stitch. You want to work back and forth, just kind of securing that loop in there. And as we get into more decorative garments or more delicate pieces, you'll start to learn ways to weave this end in that don't visually interrupt the stitch of the work. With a washcloth, this is a utilitarian object, so we want to really secure that end, give it a lot of back stitching to keep it from unraveling in the future. Okay, I'm feeling pretty good about that end being woven back in and secured there, so I'm going to cut my end. Beautiful. All right, we have officially made a washcloth. Congratulations, guys. Very exciting. Okay, the next thing I'm going to show you guys is, sorry, that is my dog snoring, having puppy dreams in the background. So the next thing we're going to do is learn how to block the work, which is more common for garments than it is for like a utilitarian object like a washcloth, but it's an important step in making our work look really nice and beautiful. So that's next.